Welcome back to another episode of the Gritty Hour. I have a returning guest, Dr. Jim Curtis, who you may have seen in a previous podcast. We were talking about Bob Dylan and his music and his influences on a lot of other artists. And now we're having Dr. Curtis back to discuss a little bit about Bob Dylan, what he's doing now, what he's been doing for the last few years, non-musical for the most part. And we're going to delve a little bit into that today. So welcome back to the Gritty Hour, Dr. Curtis.
I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate you having me back, Tom.
Oh, thank you. And I know you're an expert on Dylan. I'm going to link to the previous podcast at the end of this podcast, and you'll see the book that he wrote about Dylan, and I urge you to go out and purchase that. It's a great book. So tell us a little bit about what Dylan's doing now.
Well, I imagine that everybody understands that Bob Dylan is a very complicated artist.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I want to do here is to certainly talk about Dylan in the 21st century, but since this is Bob Dylan we're talking about, we need to go back to the 20th century, and I want to create something like a through line, a general understanding that people will have so that they can make sense of what seems like very strange stuff that Dylan has been doing in the 21st century. So here's where we begin. We begin at this crucial night, July 25th, 1969. A whole book has been written about this. It's called The Concert That Broke Rock and Roll. This was, of course, the infamous concert at which Dylan appeared to Newport Folk Festival, not playing an electric guitar, playing a wild electric guitar and singing like a Rolling Stone. The story is well known. If you're a rock fan, you know what happened. What happened was people booed. They were shocked. They were horrified. And my larger point is that this was a key moment in Dylan's career, because for the next 10 years, people were asking themselves, why did Dylan go electric? And there's a lot of answers to that. It means a lot in various ways in Dylan's career. But the key point I want to make here is that at this concert, it became apparent that there was a distance between Dylan and his audience. No matter how charismatic he was, no matter how entrancing his songs were, there was a distance between him and his artists, and that distance has continued in various ways throughout his career. It's one of the defining characteristics of Dylan's art. So what was the distance from? Let's go back to one of the defining artists of rock and roll, Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry is maybe the most influential single artist in the history of rock and roll, and he's influential in two ways. Everybody knows, I hope, the great refrain from rock and roll music, "Hail, hail, rock and roll, deliver me from the days of old." This is the first thing that Chuck Berry did. He proclaimed, he positioned, we would say in advertising, he proclaimed that rock and roll was different from the past. It was a deliverance from the past, and this continues in lots of ways throughout the history of rock and roll. In some ways, you could say that Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run is another riff on Chuck Berry. But also, the other thing that Chuck Berry did was to differentiate rock and roll from classical music, and thereby the difference between high culture and popular culture. Popular culture was fun, it was exciting, it was different from stultifying, boring old high culture. Now, my point in talking about Chuck Berry in a presentation of Bob Dylan is to say this. Bob Dylan doesn't believe either of these things. Dylan has what I would call a unified mystical sensibility. For Dylan's mystical sensibility, there's no difference between the past and the present. They coexist and they interact. Same thing for culture. There's no difference for Dylan between high culture and popular culture. They coexist and they interact. And that is, I present to you the essence of the source of his creativity. I cite here the line from When I Paint My Masterpiece. The streets of Rome are filled with ancient footprints are everywhere.
Mm.
Well, yeah, they are, but only if you have Dylan's mystical sensibility can you see ancient footprints, because the past, the ancient past, is very much present in his sensibility and in his music. So that's what we want to start with. For Dylan, he differentiates himself from what everything that Chuck Berry and Chuck Berry's influence represented. For him, the past and the present are co-equal, they're co-present, and high culture and popular culture are. Now, what we're doing is creating a through line for Dylan's career. And in order to do that, we have to start with a woman in this first major album of Dylan's, Free Will of Bob Dylan. If you're a real Dylan fan, you know the woman here is Susie Rotolo. She was Dylan's first girlfriend. And she wrote a memoir about him using this picture, A Free Will in Time, memoir of Greenwich Village in the 60s. Susie Rotolo is of tremendous importance in Dylan's evolution, and I'll tell you why. When Dylan came to New York in the winter of 1961, he was a country bumpkin. He had probably never been in a museum in his life. He was a prodigiously talented country bumpkin, but he'd spent all his life in provincial Minnesota. He hung around and sort of didn't go to classes, didn't learn much of anything at the University of Minnesota. And when he came to New York, he was simply overwhelmed. He was wandering around lost, and Susie took him in hand, so to speak. She was Italian, as her name indicates. She took him to the Museum of Modern Art. She took him to Metropolitan Museum. It was through her that he was made aware of painting and of New York culture in general. Without her, he would have been lost and wandering around.
Was she from New York, Doctor?
She was from Queens, I believe.
Okay, all right.
Italian family in Queens. And came to New York. She was an art student at NYU when they met.
Okay.
She went to Italy to study art and wrote back to Dylan, my God, you've got to read this book. This is a book, this is a memoir called Life with Picasso by Francois Gillot, with whom Picasso lived for about 20 years, with whom he had 2 children. And she said to him, you've got to read this book because you're like Picasso. You are just like Picasso. This was the first connection that anybody made between Bob Dylan and Picasso, and I argue that it is an essential one. Pablo Picasso, dates are 1881, 1973, is the most important, most influential artist of the 20th century. And he and Dylan, or Dylan and Picasso, if you like to put it like that, have tremendous affinities. Both of them are secret. Bob Dylan is, Picasso was, a secretive genius. He didn't like to talk to people about what he was doing. He didn't like to let people know what he was doing. They're both, Dylan is and Picasso was, very manipulative. Picasso treated women very badly, and so did Dylan. He had there were these 3 women from New York in the 60s. First, Susie Rotolo, then the wonderful, tremendously talented Joan Baez, and then Sarah Lowndes, whom he married and later divorced. So with Dylan and Picasso, what we have is a series of affinities, of sensibilities, and in their careers. If Dylan was a poet who did painting, Picasso was the opposite. He was a painter who wrote poetry. This is a sheet from the manuscript of one of his poems in my book that Tom was kind enough to mention, Decoding Dylan. I talked about it, and time does not allow us today to discuss the tremendous affinities. You can go through Dylan's career literally album by album and make connections between his albums and Picasso's paintings. Let me just give you one example. If you listen carefully to Dylan's songs of the 60s, What you hear is recurring references to Picasso and what Picasso meant to him. There's a line from Desolation Row, I had to rearrange their faces. Well, if you know Picasso's work, you know that he's referring here to Picasso's paintings of the late 1930s, in particular, this portrait of Dora Maar. He was infamous for painting eyes on both sides of the faces and literally rearranging their faces. So when Dylan says, I had to rearrange their faces, what he's doing is associating himself with Picasso and with Picasso's style. When we understand that, we can also understand some of the affinities between Picasso and his contemporaries. The 1960s in New York was a tremendously exciting time for painting, in particular, not so much for Dylan. Dylan sort of stood out alone as the major recording artist in New York in the 1960s. But Roy Lichtenstein was somebody with whom Dylan has a lot of affinities. Like Dylan, he was entranced by Picasso, and like Dylan, he incorporated some of Picasso's style into his work. He's known as the principal proponent of what became known as pop art. Mm-hmm. So here we have Roy Lichtenstein using comic book techniques and combining them with Picasso's distinctive style of rearranging people's faces. Very much the same kind of thing that Dylan was doing in his songs. Another feature of Dylan's connection with painters is Dylan's connection with other Jewish painters, in particular, the other great modernist artist, in addition to Picasso, with whom Dylan has affinities, is Marc Chagall. This is his most famous painting, I Am the Village, which might be translated as My Attitude Toward the Countryside. And you see in it this jumble, this juxtaposition of images and landscapes and themes. This is very much the kind of thing that Dylan does in songs like Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues. If you don't remember, Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues begins with a great line, when you're lost in the Juarez in the rain, and it's Easter time too. That jumble of things juxtaposed in a provocative way is something that Dylan learned, or shall we say, perfected by looking at Chagall's paintings.
Doctor, did Dylan ever meet Picasso? Because they were
they didn't. Okay. I wondered about that. No, they did not. He died in 1973, and I don't. And by that time, Dylan had gone to England, of course, in the famous tour in the 1960s, but he had never been to France. Picasso was living in France, and particularly in the south of France in later life. So it would have been difficult for them to meet. In any case, Dylan didn't go to France, I think, until the 1980s when he was touring there.
Oh,
that would have been a fascinating meeting if they had.
Sure.
Okay, so entranced by Picasso as he was, Dylan started taking painting lessons in New York in the 1960s, about the time he was writing Desolation Row. And in 1970, put out an album called Self-Portrait. Now, here's a principle. If you're interested in Dylan's art, both his songs and his paintings, and he does something unusual, the immediate reaction should be, what did Picasso do? What is the source? What is the relevance to Picasso? And the answer is this. Dylan's Self-Portrait, that's a literal self-portrait, that's the album cover from the album, and it is related to Picasso's Self-Portrait from 1907. Dylan, after Picasso, was fascinated by portraits. I was lucky enough to go to the first World of Bob Dylan conference in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Bob Dylan Research Center is located. And at that time, Dylan's face value exhibit was on. He became, like Picasso, is entranced by doing portraits. There's a series of portraits, not just the self-portrait, but there are something like, I think, 30 of his portraits of people, usually men, in that. This is Nick Riley from 2019. This is, for my money, Dylan's most moving and wonderful portrait. It's from the Asia series. This is a rare example in which Dylan lets his spirituality come through in his paintings. Most of his paintings are distinctly secular, but this is a very moving, wonderful. I think this is just a wonderful, wonderful painting. You'll notice the highlights of the light on the robe. Only a very sophisticated, very confident painter can paint highlights like that.
Yeah, I've never seen that before. It's very well done.
Beautifully done. But more typical of Dylan's art is this one too many from a couple of years ago. By the standards of the artists who show in New York City, in the galleries there, Dylan is a fairly conservative painter. So far as I know, he's never done any abstract work. He's never done anything that's really as daring as his own songs. So I show you here One Too Many by Dylan. A guy passed out in a New York bar, and that is relevant to what is called the Ashcan School. The Ashcan School is a group of painters, most of them emigres like George Lukes, who painted scenes of ordinary daily life. They were called the Ashcan School because they didn't paint glamorous portraits, but rather they painted people who were middle class and lower middle class on the streets of New York. So Dylan and the Ashcan School is another connection in addition to Dylan and Picasso. This, ladies and gentlemen, is my candidate for Dylan's most beautiful and most successful portrait. Nothing in Dylan's earlier painting prepares us for Blue Misty March. These are just exquisite colors. You see the plants rising out of the marsh on the right here. I think this is just wonderful.
It's almost an entirely different approach than One Too Many.
Very much so, very much so. And this is why I wanted to put those two paintings side by side, because what I would say is that in some ways, Dylan, in his painting, Dylan is still finding himself. It's characteristic of young painters, Picasso is the classic example, who go through a series of very different styles and periods in their early work. It's though, what I would say is that Dylan is still finding himself as a painter. It's like he's experimenting with various things. You saw, I showed you this portrait of the monk. I showed you One Too Many, a guy down and out in a bar, and now this beautiful lyrical painting. Nothing in his other work prepares us for this. It's like another part of his talent.
Now I understand why you started musically with the electric Dylan in '65. Right. It's a point well taken, yeah.
Okay. Dylan is not known for his love of the West, but he probably has seen a lot of John Wayne movies. And John Ford directed John Wayne movies in Westerns that famously showed Monument Valley. And so we go from these portraits, from the intimate portrait of the monk to the wide open spaces of the West. So now I've shown you a series of Dylan's paintings. Each of them is completely different from all the other paintings that I've showed you. It's one of the most remarkable things about his paintings. It's like these different aspects of his art keep coming out. Frankly, he probably would never say this, but frankly, I suspect he himself is surprised by some of these things. Okay, we're now firmly in the 21st century. I said this is about Bob Dylan in the 21st century, and I started out by making the point that we need to understand Bob Dylan in the 20th century before we could get him into the 21st century.
Right.
Now that we understand the interrelation of past and present, high culture and popular culture, we are now ready to understand the key to his work. Let us say that now, he's 80 years old, Bob Dylan is no longer Bob Dylan the artist. Bob Dylan is a cultural institution, an important segment of American culture. And as such, it's my sense in his declining years, what he wants to do is to do assimilation, to bring things together. That is my explanation for the longest song Dylan's ever written, Murder Most Foul from 2020. Murder Most Foul is over 16 minutes long. It's almost as long as George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. And we find in it a classic example of the way Dylan senses the past and the present coming together and high culture and popular culture coming together. It's called Murder Most Foul, and that line is taken from Hamlet, specifically Scene 1, Act 5, in which the ghost of Hamlet's father appears to him and tells him that he's been murdered and lays on Hamlet the obligation to avenge his murder. Mm-hmm. And so he uses this phrase, murder most foul, as in the best it is, but this most foul, strange, and unnatural. So that's the origin of the line. What does it mean? What specifically, what does it mean for Hamlet? As you might imagine, if you've never seen Hamlet, Hamlet is shaken to his boots by the sight of his father's ghost and by the obligation that his father laid on himself. So he then has this very famous monologue in which he says, the time is out of joint. Of course, it's spite that ever I was born to set it right. I suggest to you, this is a way of thinking about Bob Dylan. It was Chuck Berry, the wonderful, exciting, influential Chuck Berry, who in effect put the time out of joint because he said, rock and roll will deliver us from the past, the disconnect between the past and the present. In cultural, in historical terms, the assassination of President Kennedy put the time out of joint. It separated what came before the optimistic culture of the 50s with the difficult, problematic, exciting culture of the 1960s. And if you want to think about it like this, and I do, Dylan was born to set the time right. He was born to assimilate, to bring the past and the present together, which is a lifetime endeavor. We don't have time today to discuss Dylan's book, The Philosophy of Modern Song, but it is a clear example of what he means by what I mean when I say that this is a time of assimilation for him. He assimilates people that only Dylan knows about, or shall I say, only Dylan really cares about. Dylan, among many other things, is very interested in roots music, minor figures from the history of popular music and gospel and jazz and so forth. This is why Murder Most Foul is so long, because there's list after list after list of these relatively obscure figures that Dylan knows and cares about.
You have to help me out though on that the previous slide there. I know Little Richard, but who are the other two?
The other two, there's a woman, I believe her name, she, as you might guess, she was a lesbian. I think her name was Lily Federer. She wanted to position herself as a female Elvis. She was sort of a flash in the pan in the late 50s, and this is Johnny Holiday on the right. This is the kind of thing.
Is this a photo? Is this a photo from Dylan's book?
This is the cover.
Oh, that's the cover. Oh,
yeah, this is the cover.
It's interesting that he chose that photo then.
Indeed, isn't it? And there are a lot of others like this, of comparably obscure figures.
Right. With a major figure on the left, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Probably if you're a Dylan scholar like me, you remember, how is this for a trivia quiz? What did Dylan write in his high school yearbook when he graduated from Hibbing High School?
I don't know.
The answer is, I want to join Little Richard.
Wow.
So this is before he discovered Woody Guthrie, and his idol at the time, before he discovered Woody Guthrie and certainly Picasso and all these other people, his idol at the time was Little Richard.
He never vocalized an explanation for choosing this photo, has he? Did you know of? Okay.
No, it's enigmatic, like all these other things.
Right.
And now for something completely, utterly different. In addition to writing songs, in addition to doing these wonderful portraits. Dylan has been doing welded iron sculpture. This is his masterpiece. This is a huge ornate sculpture called Portal, 26 feet long, wide by 15 feet high. It was an installation specifically commissioned for the MGM Casino in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. It is, of course, it is a masterpiece. It is one of the defining works of his later life, and I have some things to say about it, as you might imagine. Dylan, being Dylan, has a welding studio in one of his houses in Malibu, and here is Dylan working on Portal, this iron sculpture. Now then, it is important to understand Dylan's sensibility as assimilated, my keyword that I keep going back to. When somebody asked Dylan, why did you do this gate? What does it mean? And Dylan said, gates appeal to me because of the negative space they allow, spoken like a true modern artist. They can be closed, but at the same time, they allow the seasons and breezes to enter and flow. They can shut you in or shut you out. And this is classic Dylan. And in some ways, there is no different. Now, I want to use a fancy word. There's a word called liminal, and the noun is liminality. But what it really means is transition. Liminal space is a transitional space that's neither in nor out, as in gates. So I present to you the cover of Dylan's Street Legal album. And where do you find Dylan? We find Dylan in liminal space. He's neither in nor out. He is standing in the doorway. So I suggest to you that the cover of Street Legal is one of the sources of the Iron Gate that I just showed you. Moreover, when you examine Dylan's songs closely, as I've done, what you find is that Dylan, the singer, positions himself in liminal space, or to use the obvious word, transitional space. In my book, I show that this goes back to Mr. Tambourine Man. Here's another trivia question for you. Where is the singer in Mr. Tambourine Man? The answer is he's on the beach. And what is the beach? It's a transitional space between earth and sea. In Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, where is the singer? The singer is outside the monastery walls singing to the Sad-Eyed Lady, who is the version of the Virgin. And then he's in this later song, he's knocking on heaven's door. Is he in heaven? No, he is not. He is knocking on the door. He is in the transition between earth and heaven. This is also true of his great, great song, I Shall Be Released. He's not in heaven. He is not released from these earthly bonds. He has not entered heaven, but he shall be released. It's one of the key elements of Dylan's song that he positions himself in transitional space, neither in nor out. If you want to push it, I suggest this may have something to do with his sense of himself as a Jew, as a partial outsider in American culture. No matter how important he is in some senses still an outsider in American culture, looking, on the outside, looking in, and that's where he positions himself in a series of his songs. Okay, now let's go back to Portal. Portal, this large sculpture, has a coherence about it, which you may not notice unless you've studied it as I have done. I direct your attention to the lower left-hand corner here. Go down here and look at the lower left-hand corner of Portal, and what do you see? You see a circular form of wheel. Well, since Dylan is nothing if not coherent and cohesive, let us examine the sculpture and ask if we can find any other wheels. Well, as a matter of fact, we can. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then here, where a rose window would be positioned in a Gothic cathedral, we have the crowning wheel positioned exactly in the middle over the portal. And then we go to here, to here, to here, to here, to here, to here. In short, what we have is a rectangular form that encloses circular forms being the symbols of wholeness and completeness.
Those of us who are, those of you who are listening to us on Apple or Spotify or whatever, I suggest you go to our channel on YouTube to get the visuals for this presentation. Go
Yes,
ahead, Doctor.
that's a good tip. Thanks for
Yeah.
mentioning that. Well, I've said before, if Dylan has done something remarkable and unusual, and we want to ask ourselves, why did you do that? Where did you get the idea for doing that? Your reference point is usually Picasso. So here we have this iron sculpture, which is totally unlike anything we can imagine Bob Dylan, the author of Blowing in the Wind, doing. So we want to ask ourselves, is there any source for this? Is there anything, has anybody ever done anything like this before? And guess who has done something like this before? Pablo Picasso.
Mm.
Now, if you and I, as a non-artist, were to look at a bicycle, we'd say, oh, that's a bicycle. But if you're Picasso, you say, I can take that bicycle apart. I can use the handlebars for horns, the seat for the head, and I can create a sculpture and I can call it the head of a bull.
Yeah, I didn't even know it was a bicycle till you said it. Thought it was a head of a bull.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
there you are.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. Picasso, as we know, we saw those portraits from the 1930s, which you rearranged people's faces. Well, he also did that with three-dimensional objects in a variety of ways. Picasso had this long, varied career. We don't have time to go into it today, but one of the things he did was to disassemble things and put them back together again in unexpected ways.
I wonder if he anticipated the shadows as being part of the presentation.
My guess, I wondered about that myself. I think this is an artsy photograph. I don't think he thought the shadows would be part of it, but they work very well.
Right, I get you. Okay. They do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
As you may know, Picasso was a Spanish immigrant. He spent almost his entire artistic career in France. And there is a French word for what this thing is. The French, well, I should say French phrase. The French phrase is objet trouvé, which is French for found object.
Mm-hmm.
The use of found objects begins with somebody named Marcel Duchamp, a very innovative French artist. And the idea was this: you don't need to paint anything or create a separate thing to make art. Just wander around and pick up things, find things. But the trick of the artist is to recombine them in unusual ways and make something unexpected out of them, as in this head of the bull.
Right.
As in Picasso's sculpture from 1951, Baboon and Young. Picasso, and only Picasso, would think of taking a child's toy car and using it as the head of a baboon. But that's Picasso.
I see it. Yeah.
See that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Interesting.
Okay, so that's found objects. But that's a fancy term. It's French. We Americans don't like terms like that. So in the 1960s, when Dylan and a lot of other artists were fascinated with Picasso, they didn't want to use the phrase objet trouvé because that was French and sounded too fancy and too foreign. So they called it, in a very American way, junk art. Art is what you make of junk, and it's junk art. I mentioned before Roy Lichtenstein as an artist who has very significant and very important associations, affinities with Dylan. They were both living in Greenwich Village at the same place. They were in the same place at the same time, doing very much related work. Robert Rauschenberg was another of this amazingly fertile, productive cluster of artists living in Greenwich Village in the 1960s. And he didn't want to call it found object. He wanted to call it junk art, and that's what it is. So what he has is Curlicue Summer Glut from 1988. You'll notice that he too is intrigued with these wheels. You go into junk art, you find old wheels, and you take them out of their context, you put them together again, and you create modern art out of it. That's what Dylan did with Portal. That's what Robert Rauschenberg did almost 40 years before Dylan did.
Interesting.
Here's another affinity between Dylan and Robert Rauschenberg, and for that matter, between Dylan and Roy Lichtenstein. I touched on this when I showed you this Roy Lichtenstein painting. Precisely at the time when Dylan was writing Desolation Row, in which he referred to famous figures like Einstein and Casanova, Rauschenberg was doing what we scholars call intertextuality, referring to the past, incorporating the past into his work. So he has this painting called Persimmon from 1964, and in it he incorporates Rubens' paintings, Venus and a Mirror from 1615. There's a lot of finish, and time does not allow us to do this. It would be pretty detailed work, but if you wanted to be serious about Bob Dylan in the 1960s, what you would do is to take Bob Dylan, Roy Lichtenstein, and Robert Rauschenberg and show that they were all doing this pretty much the same thing, the same place, the same time. It's remarkable.
Interesting.
There's another Jewish artist that Dylan has affinities with named Louise Nevelson. This is an imitator of Louise Nevelson, and you'll notice immediately the similarities between this work and Dylan's portrait. You see the round forms, you see the abstract nature of the work. Louis Nevelson also does very large abstract iron sculpture, but my larger point is that whenever Dylan does something, he does it in an innovative and creative way. And it is also true that what he does has affinities with other art movements and other artists. Right. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, a very brief tour through Bob Dylan in the 21st century, connecting Bob Dylan in the 20th century to Bob Dylan in the 21st century. As for the future, who knows? As I said, Dylan is in his 80s now. When I was in Tulsa at the Bob Dylan conference, people said that they had heard that he had been having problems with arthritis. He may not be able to play the guitar for very much longer. That may be one reason he's turned to painting and sculpture. But we can be sure that as long as Dylan is alive and conscious, he will be doing things that excite and surprise. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor.
And Tom, I want to thank you so much for your generosity in giving me this chance to.
Believe me when I tell you, it was our pleasure. I learned a lot tonight, and it was. I'm amazed at how well you tied one thing into the other in terms of explaining where he's coming from, where Dylan is coming from. You know, yeah. And
here's the way I would say it. Mm-hmm. Although I've never met Dylan, I'm sure I never will, I have lived with Bob Dylan for half a century now. And when you live with Dylan for that long and you think about his work and his songs are in your mind and you keep asking yourself, why does he do this? Where is this coming from? What can we understand about him? Then you start making these connections because, as I believe, Dylan, beginning with this tremendously important experience when Susie took him to the Museum of Modern Art. He is like a sponge. He takes things in, he takes things in, he takes things in, and he recombines them in ways that no one expects. It is tremendously exciting to be alive at the same time as Bob Dylan.
Well, you mentioned you may never meet him, but in the magical world of the internet, you never know.
That's right.
This might find its way to him, and he'll reach out to you and say, Doc, you were spot on.
That would be the thrill of a lifetime.
I can imagine. But I certainly appreciate you coming on again. And really, I learned a lot tonight. So I do appreciate your visit. And we're going to have another podcast a couple of months down the road, if it's okay with you, with my friend George Bauer, who you met in the previous podcast you
Sure.
were on.
I look forward to talking to George
Talk,
again.
talk a little bit about music history.
And
And
we will do, we won't do art history, we will do Bob Dylan and music history. And
yes,
that too, I think, is a subject that's insufficiently appreciated.
yes, and we'll touch on that on the next one. And I thank you for coming by to show us this. It was a great pleasure, sir.
Terrific. It was a great pleasure for me to present this. Thank you
All
very
right.
much
And we'll see you
for the
further on up the
opportunity.
road. Thank you,
Okay.
Doc.